Okay, so this chapter, chapter 32, is called Open Economy, no, Comparative Advantage in the Open Economy. I'm going to call it international trade. So what I want to do today is I'm going to show without a doubt that in the long run, trade benefits everybody. So if we would trade with each other, we would all benefit. Everybody benefits. Okay. But then we have to think about it. Okay, so I'm going to show it with numerical values, you know, and I can put in any numbers. You can give me the numbers and I will prove it to you that everybody benefits. But then if everybody benefits, then how come there are so many people who are protesting? Whenever there's a WTO meeting, you have lots and lots of people protesting. Well, obviously they must not benefit from trade. So we're going to see that, well, in the long run, everybody benefits from trade. In the short run, trade can certainly cause some friction. Some people may lose their jobs. And obviously that's not a pleasant situation for them. Okay, so before we start out with trade, I can just explain how come trade benefits everybody without really going into any, it's self-evident, okay? It's really self-evident that trade must benefit everybody. Because folks, let's think about it. When we trade with Mexico, do we do it for their sake? Do we do it because we care about them and we want them to benefit? Of course not. We do it only because we believe that we benefit. And when they trade with us, I don't believe that they do it because they really care about us. No, they do it only because they believe in their own benefit. So if trade takes place, then obviously both parties must benefit. So in general, trade only takes place only and only if you get a benefit from it. Okay, so it's actually self-evident, but we're gonna use also some numbers, and I'll show mathematically how trade benefits everybody. Before we start that, I just want to give you a couple of definitions, and then we'll start the whole thing. So two definitions. One is the definition of absolute advantage. And what absolute advantage is the ability to produce more of a good. And I'm going to put something in parentheses. My printer. My printer actually doesn't, almost never works. So I'm going to put something in parentheses. I'm going to put per person, and I'll explain in a second the reason why. Because I don't want you to think that one country has absolute advantage. In other words, they have the ability to produce more because they're bigger, because they have more resources. No, because it's per person. So it's the ability to produce more because you're better at it. Okay, so if one country is better at one good and another country is better at a different good, then one country has absolute advantage in one good and the other one has absolute advantage in the other good. Okay, now let me just show you the definition for comparative advantage, because really comparative advantage is what we're going to use as a reason for trade. So the basis for trade is comparative advantage. So comparative advantage is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. In other words, basically is the ability to produce a good cheaper. Okay. So this is really the basis for trade, because I'm going to explain to you what is absolute advantage and then what a comparative advantage is, and how come we need comparative advantage. Okay, so let's take a look at a case of absolute advantage. Let's say we have two countries, two goods. So here is the US and Japan, and TVs and DVDs. I know that people don't use DVDs anymore, but doesn't matter. And let's say that we have a situation like this. So in the US, we are able to produce 10 TVs per person, while in Japan, they produce only 5 TVs per person. In the US, we have the ability to produce 2 DVDs per person, while in Japan, they produce 8 DVDs per person. Clearly, the United States has absolute advantage in TVs. We are better at producing TVs than Japan, and Japan is better than the US at producing DVDs. Well, certainly the US can produce both TVs and DVDs. And Japan can produce both TVs and DVDs. But both countries would be better off to specialize in the good that they have absolute advantage, and then they should trade with each other. So the US should specialize in TVs, Japan should specialize in DVDs, and then they could trade with each other. And both countries would be better off. Okay. Now, I just want to make a simple note so you know that when one country has absolute advantage in one good and the other country has absolute advantage in the other good, then you don't even have to think about comparative advantage because it goes exactly the same way. So the US has comparative advantage in TVs and Japan has comparative advantage in DVDs. They should specialize in those goods where they have the comparative advantage, and then they would trade with each other. Okay, but what if we have a situation like this? Now we have a situation where the US has absolute advantage in TVs and the US has absolute advantage in DVDs. So the US is better at both. Does it make sense for us to specialize, for the US to specialize in something and for Japan to specialize in something else and then trade with each other? And the answer is surprisingly yes. Yes, it does make sense. Okay. Even though we are better in TVs and we are better in DVDs, it's kind of like, think about it. You're a great CEO, and you know, whatever you do, whatever products you launch, you are launching them at the right time. You market them the right way. You are a very successful CEO. And you need to hire yourself an assistant to do all the typing, all the emails and so on. And you hire an assistant, and the assistant, you would like them to type 100 words a minute. Okay. And the assistant, sure enough, types 100 words a minute. The problem is you, the CEO, not only are you a great CEO, but you're also a great typist, and you're able to type 130 words a minute. Should you do your own typing or should you hire the assistant? And the answer is obviously you should hire the assistant, but you're better in both. Well, yeah, but your advantage is in managing. Okay. And even though the assistant is really not that good at managing or typing, between managing and typing, their advantage is in typing. So they should stick with typing and you should stick with managing. Well, the same case here. And before I'm going to do the opportunity cost by the definition, so we can find out who's got opportunity advantage, I'm sorry, opportunity advantage, comparative advantage. Before we go into comparative advantage by the definition, I want to show you kind of like a shortcut into who's got comparative advantage and what. Look at the US. A US worker is producing 10 TVs per unit of time, while a Japanese worker is producing only 5. We could say that a US worker is twice as good in TVs. But how many times is a US worker better in DVDs? And the answer is
5 times.
5 times, exactly. So even though a US worker is better in TVs and better in DVDs, the advantage goes to a US worker having the advantage in somebody?
In TVs?
Twice as good in TVs, 5 as good in DVDs. Obviously, it's going to be the DVDs. So the US has comparative advantage in DVDs, while if the US has it in one good, then the other country will necessarily have it in the other good. Because you cannot have comparative advantage in both, because you're saying comparatively between those two, where is my advantage? Well, if I have it in DVDs, obviously I cannot have it at the same time in TVs. So the US has it in DVDs. Well, let's take a look from Japan's perspective. We already know that Japan has it in DVDs. Well, what Japan says is, well, Japan has it in TVs, I'm sorry. Japan says, well, we are really not that good at either TVs or DVDs, but in DVDs, we're a lot worse than we're in TVs. So between those two, our comparative advantage is in TVs. We're not quite as bad in TVs as we are in DVDs. So between those two, our advantage is in DVDs. In TVs, I'm sorry. This is a bad lecture. Okay, so Japan has comparative advantage in TVs, and the US has comparative advantage in DVDs. Okay. So let's keep that in mind. And now let's show comparative advantage using the definition of comparative advantage, the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. So I'm going to write them a little bit smaller because I want to do some graphs. So here is US, Japan, TVs, DVDs, and was 10, 5, 5, 1. Okay. And we already remember we said Japan has it in TVs, US has it in DVDs. Okay. Now let's do that via the definition of comparative advantage. And here is the US. TVs, DVDs. If the US produces TVs, they're going to have 10 TVs and no DVDs. 10 and 0. If the US puts the resources in DVDs, they're not going to have any TVs, but they're going to have 5 DVDs. So if you will, the production possibilities curve for the US looks like this. All the resources are in TVs, they're not going to have any DVDs, but they're going to have 10. All the resources are in DVDs, they're not going to have any TVs, but they're going to have 5 DVDs. Or they can have some combination of the two, some of the resources in TVs, some of the resources in DVDs. And any combination of TVs and DVDs on this line is possible. We have the resources to produce any combination on that PPC. Now, here what I'm asking, let's do Japan now. Five TVs or one DVD or any combination in between. Okay, folks, let's take a look at the price of a DVD in the United States. Let's say there is no trade. The United States is all by itself. If in the US, if we produce 5 DVDs, we're not going to be able to have 10 TVs. So the price that we're paying for having a DVD, producing a DVD, is going to be how many TVs? Is if for 5 you give up 10, for 1 we're going to give up anyone?
2.
2, right. So the price of a DVD in the US is 2 TVs. If we choose to produce a DVD, we're not going to be able to have 2 TVs, okay? Because the resources that produce that DVD could not be used in the production of 2 TVs. Let's take a look at what is the price of a DVD in Japan. The price of a DVD in Japan is, anybody tell me, how much do they give up in Japan in terms of TVs if they produce 1 DVD?
5.
Exactly, it's 5, exactly. So it's 5 TVs. Folks, DVDs are a lot more expensive in Japan than they're in the US. So the US is able to produce DVDs cheaper, comparative advantage to the US in DVDs. That's by the definition, the ability to produce at a lower opportunity cost. Well, our opportunity cost for each DVD is 2 TVs, while in Japan is 5 TVs. So certainly we're able to produce at a lower opportunity cost. But let's take a look at what is the price of a TV in the US and Japan, because we already know that Japan has comparative advantage in TVs. So that means that by definition, Japan should be able to produce TVs at a lower opportunity cost than the US. Now, what is the price of a TV in the US? Well, if we produce 10 TVs, we give up 5 DVDs. So for each TV that we produce, we give up a half of DVD. Well, in Japan, if they produce 5 TVs, they're going to give up only 1 DVD. So each TV that they're producing over there in Japan is going to cost them 0.2 DVDs. Notice that in Japan, they're producing TVs at a lower opportunity cost than we're producing TVs here in the US. Therefore, comparative advantage in TVs goes to Japan. All right, now we know who's got comparative advantage in what. US has it in DVDs and Japan has it in TVs. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna specialize in the good where we have comparative advantage. In other words, the US is going to specialize in DVDs and Japan is going to specialize in TVs. They're going to be, so we're going to be at this production point. Now, folks, remember that if there was no trade and the US was by itself, the US would be producing someplace where we would produce both TVs and DVDs. So we would be at a point someplace on the production possibilities curve that has both TVs and DVDs, because you need them both. And the same for Japan. Japan would have a TV and a DVD industry. Now that we have the ability to trade, what we're going to do is the US is going to specialize in DVDs and Japan is going to specialize in TVs. So the US is going to produce only DVDs, Japan is going to produce only TVs, and then we start trading with each other because both countries need both TVs and DVDs. And what I'm going to show you is that both countries will benefit. Both countries will be better off with trade than without trade. Okay, so let's trade, folks. Let's trade. Let's say that the US is going to sell one DVD to Japan. Okay. Let me ask you this. This is a question for you. In the US, if we produce a DVD, we give up 2 TVs. If instead we choose not to produce that DVD, at least we're going to be able to consume 2 TVs. So in the US, if we forgo the production and therefore the consumption of a DVD, at least we're going to be able to have 2 TVs. So remember, if we forgo the production and therefore the consumption of a DVD, at least we're going to have 2 TVs. For us to be willing to take those DVDs and send them to Japan and let them consume the DVDs, we forgo the consumption of those DVDs because it's them over there who are getting those DVDs. If in my country I'm getting, if I produce it, I don't have 2 TVs. If I don't produce it and I don't consume it, at least I'm going to have 2. For me to be willing to send it to them, they better pay us what? What would they have to
At
do?
least 2 TVs.
Exactly. So they better pay us more than 2, because I got to do better than I'm doing in my own country. So if I get a better deal, yeah, I'm going to send them over there. So they got to give us more than 2 TVs. Exactly. Now, the Japanese, they don't need our DVDs because they can produce their own. But guess what? Each DVD that they produce is going to cost them 5 TVs. So the Japanese would be more than happy to take the DVDs from us as long as they're paying
Less than 5?
exactly less than 5. So they got to do better than they're doing in their own country. So we want more than 2. They want to pay less than 5. Can we find the price of trade? Of course. Now we're going to have to negotiate it. And obviously negotiations, both countries will benefit, but imagine that the price of trade ends up as 2.1 TVs per DVD. Even though both countries benefit, who gets most of the benefit in this case at 2.1 TVs? It's going to be Japan. Yeah, because they want to pay less than 5. Well, they could have paid 4.9. But if they pay 2.1, it's great. Obviously, if they're going to negotiate the price of trade to be 4.9 TVs per DVD, then the US would get most of the benefit. Okay, so I'm going to do the negotiations for them, and I'm going to say that the price of trade, 3 TVs per DVD. Okay. Okay, folks, now, remember, we started out before trade. The US specialized in DVDs, and the US had, so this is before trade. US had 0 TVs and 5 DVDs, and Japan has 5 TVs and 0 DVDs. Let's see after trade. What is the situation after trade? Remember, we started out with 5 DVDs, and then we sent 1 DVD to Japan, and they paid with 3 TVs. So after trade, US has 3 TVs because they got 3 TVs from Japan, and Do they have any DVDs left? Well, yeah, they have 4 DVDs left because they started out with 5 DVDs and 0 TVs. They got 3 TVs, but they don't have 1 DVD, so 4 DVDs. And let's see what Japan has. Well, how many TVs do they have left? 2. Do they have any DVDs? They started out with 0, but they got 1 from us, so 1 DVD. Folks, here is how we can show very easily that both countries has benefited from trade. Now, let's imagine a world without trade. If there was no trade, the US and Japan completely separate. They don't trade with each other. The US could produce and therefore consume at any point on this PPC. Agreed? Okay, good. And Japan could produce and consume at any point on this PPC. So any production point on the PPC of the US would be a possible consumption point for the US. And the same for Japan on their PPC. But notice where they are after trade. Notice where they are after trade. Let's take Japan because Japan is really obvious. 1 DVD and 2 TVs. That means that Japan has 1 DVD and 2 TVs. That's the consumption point for Japan. Japan is producing here on the PPC and is consuming here outside of the PPC. Without trade, it would be impossible for Japan to consume outside of the PPC. We would say they don't have the resources. What about the US? Let's see if the US is also consuming at a point that was impossible if not for trade. Well, 4 DVDs, so here's 4 DVDs, and 3 TVs. Here is 3 TVs. The US is also consuming outside of the PPC. How do I know that that combination of 4 DVDs and 3 TVs is indeed outside of the PPC? Because folks, I know that if there was no trade and the United States wanted to have 4 TVs, the maximum amount of DVDs, 4 DVDs, the maximum amount of TVs that they could have would be 2 TVs. Now they're able to have 4 DVDs and not just 2 TVs, but 3 TVs. So we are definitely also consuming outside of the PPC. We have benefited from trade. Japan has benefited from trade. Both countries benefit from trade. Now, in conclusion, what do we need in order for us to trade? We need comparative advantage. Has to be comparative advantage. If there is no comparative advantage, then there is no reason to trade. It's the only case where there is no reason to trade if there is no comparative advantage. So let me give you an example of no comparative advantage and then explain how come there's no need to trade. Who's got comparative advantage in what? Well, we can say that absolute advantage goes to the US. US is better in TVs, US is better in DVDs. So absolute advantage in both goes to the US, TVs and DVDs. But there is no comparative advantage. We are twice as good in TVs, we're twice as good in DVDs. You cannot say that comparatively between them, we are better at, no. there's no comparative advantage, there is no reason to trade. Well, how come there is no reason to trade? Well, let's see. Here is why. In the US, the price of a TV is 2 DVDs. And the price of 1 DVD is half of TV. In Japan, the price of a TV is 2 DVDs. And the price of a DVD is half of TV. Folks, we have exactly the same prices. So if, let's assume we were in a classroom and each classroom is a separate country. If the price of this pen in this classroom is $5 and the price of this pen, the same pen, in the class next door is also $5, do I have any reason to take my pen and try to sell them over there? No, absolutely not. But if the price here is $5 and over there is $10, then there is a reason for me to try sell it over there, because I'm going to get maybe a better price and they're going to pay a little bit less than they're paying in their own country. So we have a reason to trade. So you need comparative advantage. You need something to be cheaper. Okay, now remember that I said, well, trade benefits everybody, but I have to make another remark and say trade benefits everybody in the long run. But in the short run, it's not so easy to say that trade benefits everybody, because here's the explanation. This is why people protest the WTO, World Trade Organization meetings and stuff like that. And they're against free trade. Oh, no, 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 no. Well, folks, in the US, if there was no trade with Japan, you would have to have both TVs and DVDs. In other words, you would have a TV industry and you would have a DVD industry. And the same for Japan. If there was no trade, they would be producing TVs and DVDs, and they would have a TV industry and a DVD industry. Now, some economist comes along and says, guess what, folks? US has comparative advantage in DVDs, and they should specialize in DVDs. Japan has comparative advantage in TVs. They should specialize in TVs. And then trade with each other, and look, both of you will benefit. But it's easy to do it on paper here and say, well, the US is going to specialize here in DVDs. What did I do with the TV industry in the US? I destroyed it. And all the people in the TV industry now have to find jobs in the DVD industry. And in Japan, all the people in the DVD industry have to find jobs in the TV industry. Well, that's not going to happen overnight, you know. Once it does happen, then trade will make both countries better off. But this is going to be a painful process for the people who are losing their jobs in those respective industries in both US and Japan. So for them, don't tell them, hey, don't worry about it. It's going to be, you know, because I don't know how long that process is going to take for me to find jobs in the other industry. Okay. Just to give you another very quick example. Especially this is true because of long distance learning, you know, the online schools. I actually don't like it very much. I prefer in class. But anyway, but what could happen tomorrow? Tomorrow, some economist says, you know what, you guys, educators, you don't have comparative advantage in education. It goes to India, to educators in India. How come? Because you can hire somebody from over there. You're going to see them just as like you see me. They're going to have a board. They're going to have this. They're going to talk to you. You're going to talk to them. Exactly the same thing that I'm doing here. But they're going to pay them 1/10 of what they're paying me. Will I like that? Not at all. Not at all. I'm going to be upset about it. You might benefit because you might get to pay less. The costs are going down. But I'm not going to be very pleased with that situation. Okay. You know, economists have long said that the US has no business in the garment industry. How come? Well, it should go to Southeast Asia because they produce them a lot cheaper. Of course, they produce them a lot cheaper. The costs over there, the labor costs are a lot cheaper over there. So what should we do with all those people in the garment industry here? Well, they should find jobs in industry where we have comparative advantage, such as software development or banking in finance and stuff like that. Well, tell the people in that industry that now they got to become software engineers. It's not going to be very easy. Okay. So those people in those industries may want to be helped by the government. They want the government to protect, to install some barriers to trade. And what kind of barriers to trade can we have? Give me an example of a barrier to trade, something that will make their goods more expensive. So even though they have lower costs and they have lower prices, when they come over here, we're gonna pay a lot more for them because the government can impose some
Tariffs?
exactly tariff. A tariff is a tax that is imposed on foreign goods. Obviously, the tax is paid by us, the people who are buying those goods. But now their goods are just as expensive as our goods. Before tariffs, those goods were a lot cheaper, so they had an advantage. Now, with tariffs, we eliminate that advantage. Now, for example, another barrier to trade, before I go into other stuff, another barrier to trade, so one is tariff, and another one is quotas. With quotas, you impose a limit on the number of imports allowed, okay? And in the 80s, we almost imposed the quotas on Japan on their cars. And actually, what actually happened is Japanese, they self-imposed the quota on themselves. Voluntary export restrictions. Anyway. Just an example of tariffs and who benefits and who doesn't benefit. You know, when we had this NAFTA, and now the agreement has a different name. I forgot what the new agreement has between Mexico, us, and Canada. Okay, but basically for free trade, no tariffs, no quotas, no nothing. Okay, guess what? The farmers in Mexico, they hate that. They don't like it one little bit because it's impossible for them to compete with big farmers here, because in the US, farming is big business, okay, highly mechanized, and therefore the costs are very, very, very low. So it's impossible for them to compete with us. So in Mexico, they always protest. The farmers are always protesting the free agreement. You know, they don't like it because they cannot produce at our lower costs. Okay. Anyway, so let me do, because you may have on the test, I'm probably gonna do on the review a few more problems like this here. I want you to tell me who's got comparative advantage in what. So who has comparative advantage in TVs and who's got comparative advantage in DVDs? Here's the easy way to do it. How many times is a US worker better than a Japanese worker in TVs? 4 times, good. And in DVDs? Voila. US has comparative advantage in TVs. Therefore, Japan has comparative advantage in DVDs. So once you find that one country has comparative advantage in one good, then automatically the other country will have it in the other good. Because you cannot have comparative advantage in both or not having it either. So you gotta, if you have it in one, the other one has it in the other. Okay. So I'm gonna do a few more problems like this. Like, for example, let's change it around. No, let's do. There. I don't want to have to use a calculator or something like that. This one is clear. Who's got comparative advantage in TVs?
The US?
US. And therefore, Japan has it in DVDs. Right. You see, the US is about 3.3 times better at TVs and only 2 times better in DVDs. Therefore, comparative advantage in the TVs goes to the US, and therefore comparative advantage in DVDs goes to Japan. Okay. So you're going to see some questions like this, 1 or 2 on a test. What do we need in order to trade? Comparative advantage. As long as there is comparative advantage, there's a reason to trade. What is a tax on imports? It's called a tariff. Okay. Who pays for that tariff? The consumer in the country that imposes the tariff. Okay. Questions, comments, anything?
I have a question. It's
Yes.
slightly off topic, but it still has to do with trade. So in the example of a 2-country economy with one good each, if you look at your top graph, in the US, they have a